Okay, so this session is very special for me personally. Back in 1995, I met Professor Dina Porat for the first time as an undergraduate. In a way, that meeting, without exaggerating, changed the course of my life. In 2003, when she introduced me to Professor Gerhard Weinberg, known as the Dean of German Diplomatic and Military Historians, I went through a mind transformation in the way I perceived the events of the Second World War and the Holocaust from multiple perspectives. Having the honor and privilege of them both supervising my PhD dissertation co-produced between North Carolina and Tel Aviv University, I am very honored, excited, and delighted, and very thankful to have them both join us today on this very special occasion. Professor Dina Porat, the chief historian of Yad Vashem and head of the Conf Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry in Tel Aviv University, will chair the next session. Dear Dina, dear Gerhard, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yaron, for this kind introduction. Thank you, all the organizers, Dr. Boaz Cohen, who so ably is pushing forward the Western Galilee College from one achievement to the other. Thank you, all those who are still listening after a long and rich day. And especially thank you, Gerhard, dear Professor Weinberg, for agreeing to be hosted in this session. It's really an honor, it's a pleasure, and it's a special day. It's exactly the 22nd of June, 80 commemoration of 80 years since this, we will not exaggerate in saying this was an earth-shaking event, the German invasion into the Soviet Union and whatever followed, not just the military, the military issues, achievements, failures, etc., but the consequences to the Jewish people, to the Soviet population. It was certainly an earth-shaking event. And who is best qualified? Who could be better qualified to speak to us about this event and its significance than Professor Gerhard Weinberg? Not only had he as a child saw, witnessed, experienced up. Should I go on?
Yes.
Okay, please. He, as a child, he was 5 years old when Hitler rose to power. He was 10 years old when Kristallnacht happened and they ran away. They fled to his family to England, to the United States later, where he lived most of his life. He saw them and he knew them as a boy. He was himself a soldier in the American army towards the end of World War II, which means he not only wrote about the events, he lived through events and witnessed them. He has many achievements, a long line of achievements. It's the teaching, the students, the best universities. But I would like, out of this long line of achievements of this maestro, I would like to point out three. One is finding the second book of Hitler. Among the papers that were in the files taken by the American army in Berlin and brought to the United States, where he, for a number of years, read them, investigated them, took a thorough look at them, and found the second book of Hitler, which was unknown by that time. It wasn't published. it has not been published by Hitler. And it took time until it was published in English, certainly in Hebrew, first in German. It is an achievement because it is a sequel, a continuation of the first one, Mein Kampf, of course, and it's a historical achievement of the first grade and the first and of utmost significance. Then the way he took two of the main issues, I think is, and again, there is no exaggerating in saying that he is the greatest historian of World War II, and his book, which turned to be our Bible on World War II, A World at Arms, a global history of World War II, is a basis, a comprehensive book, a full picture. It was really difficult to write later for Anthony Beaver and others. And we have a number of colleagues here who just now were arguing about World War II out of their vast knowledge and experience. But this is really a Bible. But I would like to emphasize a third point. You know that in Tel Aviv University, World War II was taught in a certain department for military history, sometimes in general history, but most often in, here, Craig, thank you so much, is showing us the book, A World at Arms. Thank you. I think
You're
it's
welcome.
over 1,000 pages.
Yes.
In Tel Aviv University, World War II was taught in the Department of Military History, the Holocaust and the Department of Jewish History, sometimes, and Nazi ideology, etc., in the Department of General History. So it was as if the issue was taken and torn apart 2-3 pieces that were not taught, and sometimes, and most of the time, even not researched together. Here came Gerhard, and I think it is again an achievement of utmost importance. And he wrote the book, two separate issues, Siman Sheila, a question mark, historiography of World War II and the Holocaust, and showed the integration, the inseparable integration among the three, Nazi ideology, the military, and the Holocaust. And I think this is it not only gave us even a fuller picture than the book of World War II, but it made us understand the connections and the interactions among the issues and how matters really evolved. And so it is really, again, an honor to host this maestro. It's really an honor. I'm humbled to introduce him. Thank you for giving me this privilege. And now, Gerhard, you have some 35 minutes, and then 20 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. So please, the floor is respectfully yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the college for re-inviting me after I had performed a couple of years ago. The official topic that I wish to speak on is a long intended but postponed invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler was certain that the Germans were racially superior beings who could and were entitled to rule the world. But he knew that in the past, many Germans had emigrated to countries all over the world because they had not been able to find a good place and position inside Germany. As a basis for subsequent conquest of the globe, Germany needed more Lebensraum, more living space. For Germany to expand its so-called living space as a major element in its conquest of the globe, Adolf Hitler always thought and wrote in terms of heading east. Any look at a map will show that to the west of Germany, the Atlantic Ocean is not very far away, while to the east, it is many thousands of miles to the Pacific Ocean. That would be the main objective of the wars Hitler intended, and it is thus no coincidence that one of the major new, very wide railway tracks he planned would be the one from Berlin to Vladivostok, Russia's main port on the Pacific. Two wars had to precede the drive to the east in Hitler's thinking. The first against Czechoslovakia would strengthen Germany's position in Central Europe. The second would be against France and England, because it would be too dangerous to send Germany's army to and across the Ural Mountains with French and British forces close to Germany's main industrial area. The drive east that was to follow the crushing of France and England would have the additional advantage of providing Germany the oil needed for the planes and super battleships ordered in 1937 for the intended subsequent war against the United States. As Hitler knew, Germany had defeated Russia in the recent war, and as he saw it, the Bolshevik Revolution made a conquest of that country the next time even easier, because now the racially inferior Slavic population was ruled by a regime in which hopelessly incompetent Jews had replaced a partially German bureaucracy. The German weapons secretly made during the Weimar Republic and the early years of his regime would be adequate for the conquest of Czechoslovakia, and new ones developed and coming out of the factories would make defeat of France and England possible. No new weapons would be needed to crush the Soviet Union. Hitler canceled his order for the First War. Instead, he accepted the Munich Agreement that ceded the German inhabited fringe area of Czechoslovakia to Germany, a step he would regard as the worst mistake of his career for the rest of his life. To make sure that no one cheated him of war in 1939, as he believed British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had done in 1938, he had the German ambassadors to Poland, France, and England kept in Germany in the last days of August 1939. He got the war he so desperately wanted. Since Stalin, like Hitler, believed and acted upon the ideology he held, encouraging the capitalist countries to fight each other was the correct thing to do. And since he considered Germany the weaker of the contenders, he would help it so as to prolong that fighting and thereby the weakening of all of them. Hitler thought that agreement with the Soviet Union would be a fine way to preclude any effective blockade of Germany. And since whatever was conceded to the Soviet Union would be recovered when Germany conquered it, he authorized the foreign minister to yield to the Soviets when he flew to Moscow, even more than Stalin had the nerve to ask for. Once the war started with the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Soviet Union did provide Germany with lots of supplies, ran extra trains on the Trans-Siberian Railway to carry rubber from Southeast Asia, set an icebreaker to work so that a German warship could pass Siberia to sink Allied ships in the Pacific Ocean, and let Germany have a naval base west of Murmansk to aid its war at sea and assist Germany in its campaign to occupy Norway. Hitler wanted to attack in the West in the late fall of 1939 after crushing Poland, so that the invasion of the Soviet Union could be launched in the spring of 1940. But a variety of developments led to postponement of the invasion of Holland and Belgium as key steps in the campaign against France and England to May of 1940. As that operation seemed to go extremely well, it looked to Hitler and his Army Chief of Staff, General Halder, already during late May, that the invasion of the Soviet Union could be initiated that fall, most likely in the first week of September 1940. A variety of difficulties led to further postponements, and Hitler reluctantly told his military leaders on July 31st, 1940, that the attack on the Soviet Union would come in May 1941. Preparations were inaugurated, relevant orders were issued, but there would be one more postponement. Mussolini had entered the war against France and England in June 1940, when the Germans, as part of their preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union, worked out an alignment with Romania and generally increased their involvement in the Balkans. He decided to invade Greece as a way of demonstrating Italy's key role in Southeast Europe. As that effort failed in the face of Greek resistance and opened the possibility of British land and air support for Greece, leading to British bombing of the Romanian oil field, Hitler decided to rescue his Italian ally in April 41. Practical problems in the preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union, combined with the added campaign in the Balkans, to push the attack into June. The date was eventually set for June 22nd. The German army was increased to 200 divisions, and allies were recruited for the attack. Finland had been allocated to the Soviet sphere in the secret German-Soviet agreement of 1939, but the Finns had maintained their independence in the Winter War of 1939-40 and would join Germany in the hope of recovering the territory it had lost in that war and of gaining some more in addition. Romania had also lost territory to the Soviet Union as a result of the German-Soviet pact, but it could similarly expect to recover that and take even more. Italy would join the conflict with Russia, and so would Hungary. Although these German diplomatic preparations can be seen as successful, the German intelligence assessment of the Soviet Union was hopelessly wrong. It was assumed that a couple of months would be adequate for the campaign, and accordingly, there were no preparations for fighting in winter. One incident in the period of German-Soviet cooperation is revealing. In the 1920s, the Soviets had repaid the Germans for their prior support of the Bolsheviks by allowing them to train in the Soviet Union their officers in armored and air warfare, military practices which had been prohibited to Germany by the 1919 peace treaty. In return, Soviet armored warfare officers were invited to German factories where the tanks for Germany's army were produced. When they were in the factory producing the German Mark IV tank, they asked the Germans where they made their big tanks. The Germans truthfully answered that that was what they were looking at. It never occurred to any of the German top officers who would convert themselves into military geniuses in their memoirs that the obvious implication of the Soviet question was that they had bigger ones and assumed that the Germans had bigger ones also and were concealing the reality. When they invaded the Soviet Union, the Germans ran into the T-34 and the KV-1 and KV-2 tanks, realized the implication of the Soviet question that they had failed to understand at the time, and ordered new, bigger tanks. These, the Mark V Panther and Mark VI Tiger, began to be available in late 1942, but mostly thereafter. By that time, of course, the critical decision in the East had already gone against Germany. The German military plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union provided for 3 army groups, one in the north to move through northern Polish territory annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 and the Baltic states to Leningrad, which would also be assaulted from the north by Finland. The largest German army group would drive toward Moscow on the central portion of the front, and the third army group would drive into the agricultural and industrial area of the Ukraine in the south. Finland would support a German drive to Murmansk in the far north, while Romanian forces would participate in the southern end of the campaign. The planning included the initiation of the systematic killing of all Jews in the newly conquered areas. This was to be done by special murder commanders, Einsatzgruppen, police units, Ordnungspolizei, and some other special units, and it was assumed that the military would assist in this process, an assumption which proved to be correct. Communists, both military and civilian, were to be killed, and the enormous number of Soviet soldiers that were expected to be captured could be killed, left to die of hunger, or temporarily employed as slave laborers. Since the whole area to be conquered was to be settled by Germans over a period of several generations, how was the whole population of tens of millions of Slavic inhabitants to be made to disappear? The practical problems of slaughtering all of the Jews of Europe and what Hitler referred to as the areas outside Europe had been engaged and resolved in the killing of the elderly and the handicapped, as Henry Friedlander has shown. How do you define who's to be killed? How do you collect the victims? How do you kill vast numbers quickly? How do you dispose of huge numbers of corpses? And how do you recruit individuals who will kill other human beings every day, 6 days a week, as their regular job? Were all questions that had been dealt with and resolved to the regime's satisfaction by the summer of 1941, and they could be applied and further developed in the killing of Jews in the newly occupied areas. Those procedures could be and were also applied to Germany's disabled war veterans. But in addition to starvation as a result of the confiscation of crops, some new procedures would be needed to cope with the Slavic population as a whole. This issue has not been reviewed in the existing literature. So I would like to offer a possible answer to the puzzle. Among the numerous types of horrendous medical experiments carried out in the concentration camps and extermination centers on incarcerated victims, there was one that may be relevant to this issue. There were many experiments to find a way to sterilize individuals without surgical operations. Surgical sterilization of Germans who might give birth to what the Nazis considered defective children had been authorized by one of the new measures adopted on July 14, 1933, and many Germans had been operated on under this law. Anyone to whom this had happened knew what had been done to him or her. The experimentation, which was never completed to the satisfaction of the Nazis, was designed to find a way to sterilize large numbers without the victims knowing that this had been done to them. Some kind of array or other thing was to be directed at individuals as they lined up to be paid, to get their ration cards, or for some other purpose. They would not know that they had been sterilized. May I suggest that this was to be the way for the Germans to keep vast numbers of Slavic persons working on farms, in factories, in mines, or other forms of work, but never thereafter produce children. Perhaps these experiments should be seen as the other side of a policy Hitler initiated during the war. As German military casualties grew in numbers, there was the obvious result of young women having greater and greater trouble finding a German man to marry. That issue clearly would lead to a decrease in the German birth rate. Hitler came up with an answer. German men would in the future be able to marry legally several women and thus produce an adequate number of perfectly legal children, some of whom would settle in the East and replace the declining Slavic population. It may well be that the mass kidnapping of Germanic-looking babies and children belongs in this category. We know that at least 20,000 Polish kids were kidnapped in that process. As the Germans shifted more and more of their military units from west to east in 1940-41, they told the Soviets that this was to enable them to train troops at a substantial distance from British bombing. They had very few spies inside the Soviet Union and emphasized air reconnaissance starting in the fall of 1940. Stalin ordered that the German planes not be shot at from the ground or intercepted by the Soviet Air Force. He would not believe any reports from Soviet intelligence services that pointed to an intended German invasion, ignoring important information provided by such spies in top positions as Richard Zorge. He dismissed the warnings he received from the British and American governments about the planned German invasion as provocations designed by those wretched capitalist regimes to involve the Soviet Union in war with Germany. He neither wanted nor expected anything of that sort to happen. Those who years later fabricated alleged Soviet intentions of attacking Germany and thus converting the German invasion into a preventive act carefully avoided the reality of the Soviet project to take 7 years to convert the railway system in the areas annexed with German support into the wider rails of the Soviet Union. Under these circumstances, it should not surprise anyone that the initial German attack on June 22nd, 1941, came as a complete surprise to Stalin, who had continued to assume that Germany would first completely crush and occupy Britain. Enormous numbers of Soviet military planes were destroyed on the ground by the German Air Force as it initiated operations by attacking previously located Soviet airfields. German ground forces broke through the Red Army's units stationed near the border, surrounded vast numbers, and took enormous numbers of prisoners. The purge of Soviet military generals and other officers that Stalin had carried out in the 1930s certainly contributed to the troubles of a force that was still trying to recover from that purge and its own poor performance in the war against Finland in the winter of 1939-40. This is not the time to go into the details of the early military operations that have been well covered by the published studies of David Glantz and David Stahel. There are two aspects of the initial phase of the German-Soviet conflict that must be mentioned because they reflect the purpose of the whole operation as we can see them affecting developments from the first day. From the beginning of the fighting, the Germans killed large numbers of prisoners of war and let vast numbers die of hunger. By 1945, the Germans had managed to kill or let die about 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war, a totally unprecedented event in war, and surely a reflection of a portion of what was intended by the invasion. The other aspect of the first weeks of the fighting was that the killing commandos and police units, Einsatzgruppen and Ordnungspolizei, initiated the systematic killing of Jews in communities being conquered by the German army. Because the German forces advanced very rapidly in the early weeks through an area with very large numbers of Jews, they sometimes killed the men, moved on into newly conquered places, and then came back when the front moved more slowly or stabilized temporarily to kill the women and children. But they certainly knew what they were supposed to do. Their regular reports on these activities are a major source for those interested in what has come to be called the Holocaust. The initial German advance was so rapid and successful that General Franz Halder, the German Army's chief of staff, noted in his diary on July 3rd that the whole campaign had been decided in 2 weeks. The reports that he was receiving suggested to him that the Soviet state and its military were collapsing. By July 22, Hitler was equally so confident of victory over the Soviet Union that he was certain that the systematic killing of Jews could be extended from the newly occupied territory in the East to all parts of Europe under German control. What neither Hitler nor Halder realized was the reality of continued Soviet resistance that was reinforced by additional forces that might also be defeated tactically but kept on fighting. As the previously mentioned studies of glance and style show, the Red Army continued to suffer defeats, but did not collapse. This was a totally different situation from what had happened in France the preceding year. An event that might have enlightened Germany's leaders was the substantial Soviet counteroffensive in the Yelnya area not far from Smolensk that began on August 30th. The German army could hold against it and resume its advance. But the Soviet Union was clearly not a collapsing country. There is a considerable amount of controversy in the literature about Hitler's decision to order the German Second Panzer Army from Army Group Center to strike to the south to meet German armed forces striking north, and thereby cutting off the bulk of Soviet forces defending Kiev and the Ukraine, instead of concentrating on the central portion of the front and the drive toward Moscow. May I suggest that the argument of some that it was this decision by Hitler that prevented the total German victory and defeat is mistaken. Stalin had erroneously assumed that if the Germans ever did attack the Soviet Union, they would concentrate their initial military effort on the southern portion of the front in order to seize the agricultural and industrial area of the Ukraine. Soviet military forces were accordingly especially numerous in that area. This factor contributed to the somewhat slower progress of the German forces in the south. Had the Germans not acted as they did, their Army Group Center could have faced an attack from the south to cut its supply system as it headed east. That was what happened to them the following year when they struck towards Stalingrad. What also has to be considered in this connection, in my judgment, is the very clear sign that the Soviets were preparing for the possibility of the Germans actually taking Moscow in spite of the desperate Soviet efforts to defend the city. What is critical is that not only were ministries being evacuated from Moscow, but it was assumed that the fighting would continue after the city fell. There would be a fighting front for a long time over a long distance before the Germans reached the Ural Mountains, to say nothing about Vladivostok. It is in this connection important, but generally ignored in the literature, that German forces in the First World War had occupied substantial portions of the area they took in 1941. No doubt there were occasional bad incidents then, but the people in that area who had been there could quickly see that this was an entirely different army. They did not go into local hospitals, shoot all patients, and toss the corpses out the windows. They did not slaughter vast numbers of civilians. They did not kill or otherwise mistreat vast numbers of prisoners of war. The word that this was a different and exceptionally brutal enemy got around quickly and affected the inclination to resist rather than surrender. The conversion of Stalin from being a feared and even hated dictator into the admired savior of his people cannot be understood without attention to the public's reaction, what they saw and learned of German behavior in World War II. It was therefore very likely that fighting would continue on the Eastern Front regardless of alternative German military moves in the fall of 1941. The critical point is that Germany had been unable to crush Britain and thus had a continuing front in the West and in North Africa. When German forces in the latter area seemed to be doing well, Hitler could assure the leader of the radical Palestinian Arabs that all Jews in the Middle East and in the rest of the world would be killed. But as long as there was a real Eastern Front, the Germans could not send large forces to pave the way for the killing squad that was being attached to the headquarters of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander in North Africa. That meant that the Jews of Palestine and all the other areas of the Middle East could not be killed as Hitler had intended and promised his Palestinian Arab friend. The continuing fighting against the Red Army not only weakened Germany's military effort against Great Britain, whatever its details, it also weakened Germany's ability to cope with the new enemy that Germany had provided herself with. When in the fall of 1940, it had become clear that Britain could neither be conquered nor pushed to some sort of peace, Hitler had begun to urge Japan to seize British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia. When the Japanese responded that they hoped to do that in 1946, Hitler and his associate leaders realized that they hoped to do that in 1946 and that this year had been picked by Tokyo because the United States had decided that the Philippines would become independent in 1944 and that the US would give up its bases there 2 years later. The Japanese government was clearly concerned about the forces of the United States being on the left flank of any drive into Southeast and South Asia. Since Hitler expected to fight the United States, but did not yet have either the warships or the airplanes he had ordered for that conflict, the Japanese Navy and Air Force could be substitutes. He therefore promised the Japanese government that Germany would join war against the United States as soon as Japan did so, as a part of its drive to conquer British and Dutch possessions. Under these circumstances, it is easy to understand that Berlin watched with great anxiety the 1941 negotiations between Tokyo and Washington. President Roosevelt wanted to delay any move toward war by Japan until the authorities in Japan, in Tokyo, could see for themselves that Germany was not going to win its war, and as a result would give up the idea of going to war with the United States altogether. The German government, on the other hand, kept urging the Japanese to strike. There is evidence in November and December 1941, Hitler kept pushing the German army group hoping to take Moscow, in part because he was worried that Japan might not strike. In this race between the American and the German leader, Hitler won by about 10 days. Had the Japanese waited another week, they would have seen the Soviet counteroffensive in the Moscow area and the British victory over the Italians who had driven into Egypt, both in early December 41. And they would then most likely not have attacked the United States, the British, and the Dutch. The moment that Hitler learned of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and British possessions, he wanted to join the Japanese immediately, as he had promised. Because of the crisis on the Eastern Front, he was not in Berlin, but in his military headquarters in East Prussia, horrified by the prospect of having to wait several days to declare war on the United States. As he returned to Berlin, summoned the German parliament to give them the good news, and could go through the appropriate diplomatic procedures, he immediately ordered the German Navy to start sinking American ships systematically. That order was happily received and begun to be implemented by Admiral Raeder, the commander of the German Navy, who had been arguing for war with the United States since October 1939. Hitler's official declaration came on December 11, 3 days after he had learned of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The German military leaders on the Eastern Front were enthusiastic as they learned of the Japanese move. It appears never to have occurred to them that this not only meant that Germany faced another major enemy, but that the United States could and most likely would join Britain in sending military and other aid to the Soviet Union. Some of that was already arriving. And by the end of the fighting in 1945, the two countries had, in addition to vast quantities of other things, provided the Soviet Union with over 22,000 airplanes, over 12,000 tanks, and over 370,000 trucks. It should be noted that the German army was not only halted and then driven back some on the central portion of the front near Moscow in December 41, but it was also driven back in the Tikhvin area at the northern end of the front and out of Rostov-on-Don at the southern end. In the military crisis of December, Hitler fired Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander of the German army, and assumed that position himself. He also relieved the string of army group and army commanders on the Eastern Front and insisted that there be no retreats. But none of these steps altered the basic situation. German forces could stabilize the front to a considerable extent, but that certainly did not change realities. Hitler assured the assembled regional directors of the Nazi Party on December 13, 1941, that in the coming year the German army would advance at least to the Urals. But he ignored the critical point that Germany was now in a multi-front war, and he also dismissed the possibility that war with the United States could have any substantial impact on the conflict.
Yeah.
One front additional to the obvious ones in the East against Britain and now against the United States was the one that had been developing in the portions of the Soviet Union that the German army had seized in its advance. There were some who collaborated with the Germans, but there was an increasing anti-German partisan movement. This is not the time to go into the details of that aspect of the war, but it was still another front, and one in which the Germans were extremely cruel and thereby stimulated rather than terminated resistance. As the fighting in the East continued, the Japanese government urged Germany to make peace with the Soviet Union. Hitler was not interested and was not influenced by the subsequent similar suggestions from Rome. Indications coming from the Soviet Union, primarily through diplomats in the Swedish capital of Stockholm, also did not affect his position. When his friend and Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels argued for a compromise peace with the Soviets, Hitler responded to the demands that he was certainly that Germany had to make and attain, keeping the Ukraine with its agriculture and industry and the Caucasus with its oil were impossible for Stalin to agree to. There was therefore no point in even trying. There is, on the other hand, substantial evidence that Stalin was interested in a possible separate peace with Germany well into 1943. The details are not well known because the relevant Soviet archive, Stalin's papers have never been opened. Western allies were committed to the policy of unconditional surrender, and later in the war, Stalin came to join this policy. As we look back on World War II today, we need to recognize that a majority of the fighting was on the Eastern Front. This aspect of reality in no way diminishes the major contributions that Britain and the United States made. It is worth noting, and in Hitler's opinion, the possibility of Soviet assistance had been a factor in Britain's continuing to fight in 1940. That assumption was as completely mistaken as was his similarly ridiculous assumption of an easy victory over the racially mixed United States. It's perhaps relevant and worthy of note that during the years of fighting on the Eastern Front, Hitler appears to have listened to his generals less and less, while Stalin became inclined to listen to them more and more. I will not take up time now to take the examples of this, but one need to keep in mind an aspect that is never covered intelligently today because too many rely on the German memoirs. The German military had no sense of the distances and of the winter implications of depending on horses. There's a rather different aspect of the history of World War II that needs a brief mention, and that is Stalin's endless demands for a so-called second front and his equally endless complaints about the delays. The British and Americans could but rarely did remind Stalin that he really had no reason to feel surprised at being alone in Eastern Europe after having helped the Germans take control of most of Northern Europe, then most of Western Europe, and subsequently most of Southern Europe. He had created the perilous situation of the Soviet Union to a considerable extent himself. And similarly, Allied ships that he had helped the Germans sink could not rise from the ocean floor to carry additional arms and other supplies for his armies. There has been important new literature about the fighting on the Eastern Front, as some Soviet archives were opened, in some cases only temporarily. Earlier, I mentioned the works of David Stalin and David Glantz. This is not the time and place to review the works of others who have published significant studies. A recent event, however, obliges me to add a comment on a book, the proposed text of which I had received for review for the author. To Edward Westerman's book, Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, comparing genocide and conquest, published in 2016, we can now add a reference to the appointment of a Native American who had previously been elected to the Congress to a position in the cabinet of the United States. That sort of thing could not have happened to any Slavic inhabitant of Eastern Europe if Germany had been successful in the operation it initiated 80 years ago today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this tour de force. Sorry, I tried to interrupt you towards the end, but I know that people were listening and people have questions, and you have given us a lot to think about, a lot of food for thought. Thank you again. Of course, you will have the last word at the end, but please now the floor is open to questions. Please, whoever would like to be the first. Yep. Yeah, please, Craig, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Unmute, please, Craig.
There I did.
Okay.
Sorry, this is like my second or third Zoom conference, so I'm still a neophyte, so bear with me. This question is, of course, Dr. Weinberg, directed at you, but I find it interesting that in the scholarship on the Eastern Front, and it pretty much continues to this day, we concentrate overwhelmingly on the crimes committed by Hitler and the Nazis, the Einsatzgruppen, the Wehrmacht itself, and to a certain extent, I understand that entirely. And in my books, the 4 books I've published on Barbarossa since I retired from the Air Force 8 or 9 years ago, I go into great detail where necessary on these things. No attempt to whitewash any of this, but I think why is it that so much of the time, or most of the time, we fail to point out the criminality of Joseph Stalin and his regime. For example, the fact that 95% of the German soldiers captured in 1941 and 1942, and admittedly it wasn't a large amount, but they didn't survive the war. And you're absolutely correct. Of the 5.5 million or so Soviet prisoners taken, about almost 3.5 million of them were killed. But of the Germans who were taken prisoner, at least a third of them never returned back to Germany. And then, of course, the horrible crimes that were committed in East Prussia, Berlin, the rape of nearly 200,000 German women, and just the activities of the Red Army in general, in many cases, and were barbaric, particularly when you look at the partisan movement. I think a lot of the Russian people were just as terrified of the Russian partisans as they were of the Germans. But yet these issues involving the crimes of the Red Army, Stalin, the horrible repatriation of the Volga Germans and others, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. These things seem to be pretty much too much of the time just sort of swept under the rug.
Professor Weinberg,
I'm
would
not.
like to answer.
I'm sorry.
Please go ahead.
I'm not suggesting that the Russians behave perfectly, but I do think that there is a very significant difference between slightly over 2/3 of the prisoners of war coming home and slightly over 2/3 being killed and dying. The 68% of the German POWs who ended up in the Soviet Union came home. 2/3 both directions. But I think 2/3 living and 2/3 dying is not the same thing. Furthermore, we have to keep in mind that a very high proportion of the Germans who were captured were dying at the time. That's particularly true of the ones captured at Stalingrad. The doctors among the Germans in that surrounded German Sixth Army were astounded to find lots and lots and lots of German soldiers dying without being wounded. The situation of such a high portion of the Russians captured, especially in the first part of the war when lots were captured, they were still in pretty good shape. Certainly, I'm not suggesting that Stalin was the center of kindness, or that there were no rapes or other horrors. But you cannot equalize the systematic killing and dying of 2/3 of the POWs of one side with the survival and coming home of 2/3 of the prisoners of the other side. That's not the same thing just because it's roughly the same fraction. What you're talking about is the difference of over 1 million survivors as to over 2 million dead. Furthermore, the German army, as I mentioned, and as the people in the occupied Soviet Union quickly realized, behaved differently from the German army that had been there between 1914 and 1918. What is so interesting in some of the divisional histories that have appeared in Germany in recent years is the different word that soldiers of German army divisions got from their regimental commanders when they were assigned to anti-partisan operations. In some instances, they were then told, obviously by their regimental commanders, to kill all civilians. And that's what they did, down to 2-month-old babies. But other regimental commanders said that don't kill them if they're less than 2 or 3 years old. They killed everybody but the 2 and 3-year-olds. I'm not suggesting, having spent several years studying the partisan movement in the Soviet Union and having published a couple of pieces on it, that the partisans were kindly people. But the reality is that the horrors in the partisan, anti-partisan warfare were 99% committed by the German soldiers, either in the SS, in the security divisions, in the regular divisions, etc., etc., etc. So there was certainly the Red Army was not pleasant, but when it came to horrors, nobody could compete with the Germans.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure if I may interfere. I'm not sure Craig was equalizing. He was trying to say that the picture has one more aspect and one more heavy facet that should not be put under the rug. If I may interpret you. There is a lady, I think it's Kate Stringfellow. Kate Stringfellow, please, she has a question for Professor Weinberg. Would you please go ahead?
Yeah, it's actually Mr. Good afternoon.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, no problem, ma'am. I was interested, Professor Weinberg, in your comment about the Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor, that things may have changed if they had planned their attack after the defeat of the Germans in front of Moscow. What do you think might have been their alternative policy towards the United States at that point? Because obviously this is pivotal in what happens later in the war. Once we're involved from the United States perspective, our economy really does a number on the axis. So what do you think was going to be their alternative policy if they noticed that the Germans were defeated and were having setbacks prior to that attack?
Well, there was an endless debate within the Japanese government over whether to go to war at all with the Western powers. And if, as I mentioned, if they were not certain that Germany was going to win the war in Europe, they were not going to attack the United States at all. Keep in mind that since 1937, they were at war with China,
Mhm.
that there was a war going on, that they were able, with the cooperation of the Vichy government, to occupy first the northern part and then the rest of French Indochina. So they had some advantages. If they had waited just a little bit longer, they would have seen that the Germans were not winning the war. Please remember that in April of 41, they had already signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. I had to skip that part of my talk because of the time situation. But Stalin was as concerned about a two-front war as others were, and signed a neutrality pact with Japan. The Japanese decided not to join the Germans in war against the Soviet Union and signed the neutrality pact. Under the circumstances, if the Japanese had waited a bit more, they would have seen that the Germans clearly were not collapsing the Soviet Union, and that the British were collapsing the Italians, and that therefore the likelihood of Germany winning the war that it had started was not very good. And under those circumstances, they would not have attacked the United States, Britain, and the Dutch at all.
Yeah, I was really interested in that because, obviously the Japanese army officers in Manchuria had attacked the Soviets at Galkin Gol and Nomenhan, and Zhukov had really gave them a bloody nose. So I'd know they didn't want any further problems with the Soviet Union at that point. And that the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed to be having much more sway in Tokyo at that time, leading up to obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor. So that was why I was really interested to see what you thought, because it seems like the Imperial Japanese Navy, because of that setback against the Soviet Union earlier, really was hesitant to have further problems there. And, long term, would we still have been in a war with Japan? And that's the real interesting, aspect there.
Thank you. Okay. Please, Boaz, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
We can close the session. We have overspent our time. It's a good time to finish now.
Okay, may I?
Unless you want to ask yourself, or you have anyone else here that is asking and didn't have a chance.
Is there anyone who didn't have a chance to ask a question? If not, I would really add a comment question. And yeah, thank you, Boaz, for letting us know. I think Professor Weinberg, that your title was especially well worded and to the point, because it was long intended yet postponed invasion. And you showed us clearly how it was intended, in which stages of the war, and then why it was postponed, and then again until this time that we are today commemorating the 22nd of June came about. May I add that in line of your work in integrating the final solution into the stages and phases of the war, you can also say about it or define it as long intended yet postponed. And you mentioned that in the summer of 41, all those questions of killing were resolved, but you also went on to show that they also went step by step. They went step by step from shooting, looking for sterilization, the gas trucks, and only then the extermination camps. So this was also a long intended and postponed from one stage to another until they reached, unfortunately, what they wanted to do. Okay, if it's okay with you, the organizers, Boaz and Yaron, and Professor Weinberg, and all those who were with us, more than 50 people attended, very kind of them. I'd like to finish with many thanks. I think that as we started with, we did see a maestro in action, and we learned a lot, and it was a very worthy ending of a fruitful day. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Professor Porat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Weinberg, for a masterful presentation. What a crescendo for a very interesting and fruitful day. We will reconnect in 2 days on Thursday at 4 o'clock. And until then, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Porat, for hosting the session. And good night and good day to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you, Gerhard.
Yeah. Craig, I know you wanted to go on, but we can go on separately.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.